Last week, Senator Mitt Romney introduced a universal child allowance proposal that caused a big debate within the Republican Party on the role of governance in helping families to thrive.
So Senators Marco Rubio and Mike Lee, they actually released a joint statement addressing that proposal. They said, we do not support turning the child tax credit in what has been called a child allowance, deeming a universal allowance, which is welfare assistance. So the New York Times host of The Argument, Jane Coaston, she joins us now to discuss this, one of our favorites. Thanks for joining us, Jane. Good to see you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Jane, I assume you're still tracking all of these developments within the right. I'm curious what your thoughts are here. It's like a fascinating place where Mitt Romney is like to the left of Bill Clinton in 1996, and then Marco Rubio and Mike Lee are on the Newt Gingrich side of that debate. What do you make of this entire thing?
I mean, it really does sound like 1996 all over again, which is an ironic place to be after 4 years of a idea of a working class populism happening on the right, in part led by Marco Rubio. You might remember a couple of years ago, he gave a talk at Catholic University about a conservatism that could be good for family formation, something that a lot of conservatives, Orrin Cass, for instance, has been talking about for a long time. And now you see Marco Rubio putting out an op-ed in National Review saying that cash payments to families are not pro-family. And part of the argument, and I find this so interesting, is this idea, and we saw this from a couple of other conservative think tanks, saying that, well, if single mothers receive cash payments, they may not work as much, which, to me, is part of the point. Because you would want mothers, if you are a pro-family, J.D. Vance-style conservative who is thinking about the best for family formation, it would be ideal that parents spend more time with their children and less time at the workplace, having to work multiple jobs. I know that occasionally in our society we fetishize the idea of working 3 jobs or walking 12 miles to get to your workplace, but that's not good. And there was a brief point where we had the left and some people on the right, the populist right, agreed on this point, or seemingly agreed on this point. But I think I joked the last time that we spoke that in January we would see this return to free markets and free minds and libertarian economic policy. And it's February, so I hit that right on.
Jane, what is Marco Rubio doing here? Because I was a little bit surprised about his joining up with Mike Lee. Mike Lee, it makes sense, is, typical libertarian type Ronald Reagan Republican. But Marco had kind of flirted with, maybe I'll get on the kind of more populist side of the Republican Party. Maybe that's the right place to position myself. Does this represent kind of a rethinking of that posturing?
I think it does. I also think that if you are thinking about certain politicians as being weather vanes, Marco Rubio might be one of the best examples. And we see this a couple of times. Another example I was just thinking about is Representative Dan Crenshaw just put out this piece in Daily Wire talking about we spend too much time on trying to trigger the libs and we got to stop talking about fighting. And I'm like, really? The guy who made the weird action movie sequence for the Georgia runoff elections? He
spent his entire early career working with Turning Point USA doing exactly that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But we assume that he's, you've forgotten about all of that because time means nothing. But again, there are certain politicians that I think serve a purpose as being useful weather vanes and telling you where things are going. And where things are going on the right now, especially on this part of the right, because I will also note that there has been a lot of conservative support for Romney's policy. You saw Yuval Levin putting out another piece in National Review about how the Romney plan is a good idea in the right direction. My colleague Ross Douthat has also said the same. Ramesh Ponnuru. A lot of people, though, who I think felt pushed out of the Trumpian right, people who were making these arguments in 2007 when Ross and Reihan Salam wrote Grand New Party. So these ideas aren't necessarily new, but it is interesting that Marco Rubio was totally on board until it perhaps was no longer politically salient to be on board.
Right. And so I guess, look, I'll offer the defense that I've heard from the people who came out against this. They said, Jane, that this would set up for political attacks against, basically unfettered cash assistance, which would reignite the welfare debates of 1996. And I guess my pushback, I very much fall on the side of Ross. I'm curious what you think. Is we live in a fundamentally different country than we did in 1996. Our politics are completely different. As Ross pointed out in his piece, fertility rate has fallen through the floor. Child poverty has actually skyrocketed. And so the indicators and the political conditions just seem fundamentally different to me in 2021 than they did in 96, where Gingrich, Clinton-style politics reigned supreme. I'm curious what you think about that.
Absolutely. In 1996, you have just come out of the so-called Republican Revolution of 1994. You have an incentive for then President Bill Clinton to engage in welfare reform, which was interesting because Rubio described that as a negotiation. And I'm not sure that President Clinton would have described it as such, but it was this idea, especially, and I know that this might be a challenging point to some, but who does welfare and who would this plan benefit? In 1996, the understanding was that welfare benefits a group of people who are not the people who would be necessarily paying for it. But now, with a downshift in the economy for millions of Americans of all racial backgrounds from across the country,
yes,
you are seeing the idea that these cash payments would benefit single parents everywhere. That this isn't a story about the Reagan-esque welfare queen. This is a story about everyday Americans, which was true in 1996. And it's true today. And so I think that the politics has changed, the language has changed, and understanding of what this all means. I think that part of the story of Trump's rise was that a traditional economic conservative argument about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps didn't work after the Great Recession. It didn't work after a lot of people from Occupy Wall Street to the Tea Party movement saw a lot of people in the 1% benefiting and a lot of people in the 99% not benefiting. I think that this type of child tax credit, I've heard the arguments about the income brackets. I've heard the arguments on a lot of these sides. But when your best argument is that these credits could induce single parents to not work as much, which is great. Like, we want parents to spend more time with their children. If you are simultaneously voicing concern about lowering fertility rates, but also saying that single parents and parents should be working more often, perhaps we have a different understanding of how fertility works, but I'm pretty sure that it's awesome when families get to spend more time together. And when I know that we have, obviously, the value of capitalism in our society is not to be questioned, but I do think that these cash payments at this time, in the midst of a pandemic, which is why I think we started seeing this more support from this idea from conservatives in general, this idea of like this time and no other. But again, it's not 1996. This isn't the same system. And the beneficiaries of this policy would look different. And I think that changes the narrative around these policies.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Jane, I'm not sure policies ever mattered less in the Republican Party. I mean, all the dividing lines in the Republican Party are around how slavishly devoted to Trump are you. So that's why you can have, someone who stands for nothing that Trump originally ran on, but is now seen as a Trump acolyte, somebody like Ron Johnson, right? Who's now seen as like a Trump acolyte just because they're willing to indulge, stop this deal, just as because they're willing to acquit him, willing to be unfailingly loyal to him. So it makes sense that people like Marco, the weather vane, sense that moon. It's like, okay, well, let me do what it takes to stay in good with my big donors and go back to the free market fundamentalism, because that doesn't actually matter anymore in terms of where you're positioning yourself in the party.
Exactly. And one could argue that, and I'm actually going to be hosting a debate on this very subject coming up, but one could argue that right-leaning populism had a lot of the right things to say, but then when it came to actual policies, we saw a number of right-leaning populists who would talk a lot about Silicon Valley and China, but then when it came for Medicare expansion, they were suddenly silent. I also think it's interesting that, let's be clear here. The upcoming Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, it's still happening this year.
That's
and
right.
The name is America Uncanceled, because quote-unquote cancel culture is the biggest issue facing America.
Jim Jordan told me that, too.
We just talked about that.
Jane, plug your new podcast. Tell people where they can find it.
You can find my new podcast, The Argument, at the New York Times Opinion. It's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everywhere that you do podcasts. We're going to be having a lot of really interesting conversations, a lot of really good arguments. It's going to get heated. It's going to get awkward, but that's the point because that's how we get this done.
I love it. Thank you, Jane. Really appreciate it.
Great to see you, Jane. Congrats.
Thanks so much. Good seeing you.
Coming up, Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman is going to discuss his Senate run in Pennsylvania when Rising continues.